They're taking our farms." Walter Pemberton's anguished scream echoed across the courthouse steps in Millbrook, Georgia, as Ray Charles arrived for what was supposed to be a simple small-town concert. The 52-year-old fourth-generation cotton farmer was clutching a foreclosure notice, his weathered hands shaking as tears streamed down his face. Ray Charles had come to Millbrook in the spring of 1969 to perform at the annual Peach Blossom Festival, but the town he found was nothing like the vibrant community his booking agent had described. Main Street was lined with empty storefronts, and the few remaining businesses had for sale signs in their windows. The reason was simple. First National Bank of Millbrook had closed 6 months earlier, leaving hundreds of farmers without access to the seasonal loans that had sustained their operations for generations. "Mr. Charles, I'm Mayor Delilah Crenshaw," said a tired-looking woman approaching Ray's car. "I'm afraid we might have to cancel tonight's show. Half the town's about to lose their homes, and frankly, people don't much feel like celebrating." Ray Charles stepped out of his car, his white cane tapping against the pavement as he listened to the sounds around him. Instead of the typical pre-festival bustle, he heard hushed conversations, crying children, and the distant sound of someone arguing on the phone. "Mayor Thompson," he said quietly, "sounds to me like this is exactly when people need music the most. But first, I'd like to understand what's happening here." As Mayor Crenshaw led Ray toward the courthouse, she explained the crisis that had devastated Millbrook. "First National was our lifeline," she said. "Every spring, our farmers would get seasonal loans to plant their crops. Every fall, they'd pay the loans back with interest. It worked for over 50 years. But when the bank got bought by a big corporation from Atlanta, they said we were unprofitable and shut us down. Now the nearest bank is 45 miles away, and they won't loan to farmers they don't know." Walter Pemberton was still on the courthouse steps, surrounded by other farmers in similar situations. His voice was hoarse from crying, but he continued to plead with anyone who would listen. "4 generations of my family worked this land. My great-grandfather cleared these fields with his own hands. How can they just take it away?" Ray Charles walked up the courthouse steps, his cane clicking against each stone step. "Mr. Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "I'm Ray Charles. I'd like to hear your story." Walter looked up, surprised. "Mr. Charles, what are you doing here? This isn't exactly entertainment business." "Son," Ray replied, sitting down on the step beside Walter, "I grew up poor in Florida. I know what it means to lose everything. And I know what it means to have people in power make decisions that destroy communities. Tell me what happened to your farm." Through halting words interrupted by tears, Walter explained his situation. The Pemberton farm had been in his family since 1895. Every year they planted 200 acres of cotton and 100 acres of corn, employing 12 seasonal workers and contributing to the local economy through equipment purchases, seed buying, and harvest sales. The seasonal loan from First National had allowed them to buy seed, pay workers, and maintain equipment, with the understanding that they'd pay it back with interest after harvest. But it wasn't just the loan, Walter continued. "Mr. Patterson at the bank, he knew our family, he knew our land, he knew we were good for the money, because he'd seen us pay it back 27 years running. These new folks, they just look at papers and computer printouts. They don't understand that farming isn't like other businesses." Ray Charles listened intently, asking questions about the community, the other farmers, and the economic impact of the bank closure. He learned that 47 local farms were facing foreclosure, representing over 800 families when workers and their families were included. The ripple effect had closed the feed store, the equipment repair shop, and 2 restaurants. Even the school was struggling because property tax revenues had plummeted. "Mr. Pemberton," Ray said after a long pause, "you said this has been your family's land for 4 generations. That means you've got deep roots here. And roots, they're strong things. Sometimes they just need the right conditions to grow again." "But the bank won't give us loans," Walter protested. "And without loans we can't plant. Without planting we can't harvest. Without harvest, we can't pay our bills. It's a circle that's already broken. Ray Charles was quiet for several minutes thinking. Finally, he spoke. What if the circle didn't have to run through a bank 45 miles away? What if it could run right through the people who live here? Over the next several hours, Ray Charles did something unprecedented in his career. He canceled his concert and instead called a town meeting. By 7 p.m., nearly 300 people had crowded into Millbrook High School's gymnasium, including farmers, business owners, teachers, and retirees. Folks, Ray began, standing at a microphone on the basketball court, I came here to sing songs, but I learned today that what you need isn't entertainment, you need solutions. And sometimes, the best solutions come from the people who understand the problem. Ray Charles had spent the afternoon making phone calls to his business manager, his accountant, and several associates in Atlanta's banking community. What he proposed to the assembled crowd was radical, a community-owned credit union that would be controlled by local residents and focused specifically on supporting the agricultural economy. A credit union is different from a bank, Ray explained. Banks are owned by stockholders who might live anywhere and who want maximum profit. Credit unions are owned by their members, that means they're owned by you. The profits don't go to outside investors, they go back to the community through lower loan rates and better services. The idea generated immediate discussion. People raised concerns about startup costs, regulatory approval, and whether a small community could really operate its own financial institution. Ray Charles had anticipated these questions. I've spoken with Martin Wesley, who runs the Georgia Credit Union Association, Ray said. He's agreed to send experts to help you through the process. As for startup capital, I'm prepared to make a personal investment of $50,000 to get things started. But more importantly, I've contacted 3 agricultural credit unions in other states who've agreed to share their experience. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, who taught economics at the regional college, stood up. Mr. Charles, this is generous, but starting a credit union requires regulatory approval, trained staff, and ongoing capital. Even with your investment, we're talking about a process that could take years. Ray Charles nodded. Dr. Blackwood, you're absolutely right about the timeline. That's why we need a 2-part plan. First, we establish an emergency loan fund to help farmers get through this planting season. I'm committing $25,000 immediately, and I'm asking other community members to contribute what they can. It doesn't have to be thousands, even $50 helps. The response was immediate. Retired teacher Agnes Whitmore stood up and announced she could contribute $500 from her savings. Hardware store owner Jasper Donnelly pledged $300. By the end of the meeting, the community had raised $31,000 in emergency loans. The second part, Ray continued, is building the credit union for long-term sustainability. Dr. Blackwood, would you be willing to chair a committee to navigate the regulatory process? Mrs. Crenshaw, as mayor, could you coordinate with state officials? Mr. Pemberton, would you represent the farmers' interests on the board? Over the following months, Ray Charles made multiple trips to Millbrook, often bringing business associates who could provide expertise in different areas. His accountant helped establish proper financial procedures. His attorney navigated the regulatory requirements. His booking agent even helped organize fundraising concerts in nearby towns. But Ray's most important contribution wasn't financial. It was his ability to connect people and help them see possibilities they hadn't considered. He arranged for Walter Pemberton to visit a successful agricultural credit union in North Carolina. He brought in speakers from the Small Business Administration to discuss loan programs for rural communities. He connected local farmers with agricultural extension agents who could help them diversify their crops. The emergency loan fund allowed 23 farmers to plant crops in spring 1969. By fall, all 23 had repaid their loans with interest, proving the community's creditworthiness. The success of the emergency fund also demonstrated that local people were capable of managing financial resources responsibly. Meanwhile, the credit union application process moved forward. Dr. Blackwood's committee worked with state regulators to ensure all requirements were met. Community members took courses in financial management and credit union operations. Local businesses agreed to serve as the credit union's first commercial accounts. In March 1970, exactly 1 year after Ray Charles first heard Walter Pemberton's cry on the courthouse steps, the Millbrook Community Credit Union received its charter from the state of Georgia. The opening day ceremony was held in the former First National Bank building, which the credit union had been able to purchase at a favorable price. Ray Charles returned for the opening ceremony, but he insisted that community members speak first. Walter Pemberton, now serving as the credit union's first president, addressed the crowd of over 400 people. "A year ago, I thought I was going to lose everything my family had built over 4 generations," Walter said, his voice steady and strong. "Today I'm not just a farmer, I'm a part owner of a financial institution that's committed to supporting this community for the next 4 generations and beyond." The Millbrook Community Credit Union started with 127 members and assets of $78,000. Ray Charles's initial investment had been supplemented by contributions from community members and a federal grant for rural development. More importantly, the credit union had already approved loan applications from 31 farmers for the 1970 planting season. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, who had become the credit union's first board chair, presented Ray Charles with a symbolic key to the building. "Mr. Charles, this key represents something more than a building," she said. "It represents the principle that communities can solve their own problems when they work together, and when someone believes in their ability to succeed." Ray Charles accepted the key, but his response focused on the community, rather than his own contribution. "This key belongs to all of you," he said. "A year ago, you thought your problem was that the bank closed, but the real problem was that you'd forgotten you had the power to create your own solutions. You didn't need me to solve your problems, you just needed someone to remind you of your own strength." The success of the Millbrook Community Credit Union had impacts far beyond one small town. Within 2 years, 3 other rural communities in Georgia had established similar credit unions, using Millbrook as a model. The Georgia Credit Union Association began offering technical assistance specifically for agricultural communities, and Ray Charles continued to support these efforts, both financially and through benefit concerts. Walter Pemberton's farm not only survived but expanded. With reliable access to seasonal loans and technical assistance from the credit union's agricultural specialist, he was able to diversify into soybeans and sweet potatoes, increasing his annual revenue by 40%. More importantly, he was able to hire additional year-round workers, strengthening the local economy. For Ray Charles, the Millbrook experience represented a new understanding of how his celebrity platform could be used for community development. He began incorporating economic empowerment themes into his concerts, often highlighting the importance of community-controlled financial institutions. His business manager estimated that Ray's advocacy led to over $200,000 in additional donations to rural credit union development programs. The community-controlled banking model that Ray Charles helped establish in Millbrook continued to influence rural development strategies for decades. By 1980, the Millbrook Community Credit Union had grown to over 800 members and assets exceeding $2 million. It had financed the expansion of 47 local farms, supported the establishment of 12 new small businesses, and provided affordable home loans to over 100 families. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the change in how the community saw itself. The crisis that had once seemed overwhelming became proof that local people could create solutions to complex problems. The courthouse steps where Walter Pemberton had once cried in desperation became the site of an annual community celebration marking the credit union's founding. Ray Charles continued to visit Millbrook periodically throughout the 1970s, often performing at community events and always emphasizing the same message that sustainable change comes from within communities, not from outside experts or celebrities. His role had been to serve as a catalyst, helping people recognize resources and capabilities they already possessed. Walter Pemberton often reflected on how quickly everything had changed. In March 1969, he had been facing the loss of everything his family had built over 4 generations. By March 1971, he was not only operating a thriving diversified farm, but also serving as president of one of Georgia's most successful rural credit unions. The transformation hadn't been easy. It had required countless hours of meetings, learning new skills, and taking risks that sometimes kept him awake at night. But the most profound change wasn't in Walter's financial situation, it was in his understanding of what was possible when people worked together. The man who had once felt powerless against distant corporations now regularly spoke at conferences about community-controlled economic development. He had become an advocate not just for farmers, but for any community facing economic challenges. Ray Charles's involvement in Millbrook had evolved as well. What began as a canceled concert had grown into a long-term commitment to rural economic development. He established the Ray Charles Rural Development Fund, which provided both financial support and technical assistance to communities interested in forming cooperative financial institutions. The fund had helped establish credit unions in 17 communities across the South by 1975. The success in Millbrook had also influenced Ray Charles's music. His 1972 album Message from the People included the song Millbrook Blues, which told the story of a community that refused to accept defeat. The song became popular on country radio stations, introducing urban audiences to the challenges facing rural America while celebrating the resilience of small-town communities. That song means more to me than any hit I ever had, Ray Charles said in a 1973 interview with Rolling Stone magazine. Because it's not about me, it's about what ordinary people can accomplish when they stop waiting for someone else to solve their problems and start believing in their own power. The Millbrook Community Credit Union continued to innovate throughout the 1970s. Under Dr. Sarah Mitchell's leadership, it became one of the first rural credit unions to offer financial education programs in local schools. High school students learned about budgeting, saving, and responsible borrowing, preparing them to make informed financial decisions as adults. The credit union also pioneered agricultural lending practices that accounted for the unique challenges of farming. Instead of requiring traditional collateral, they developed loan products based on soil quality assessments, historical weather patterns, and farmers' track records. This approach allowed younger farmers to access capital without having inherited land, helping to prevent the consolidation of farmland into fewer hands. By 1978, the Millbrook model had been studied by development economists from 3 universities and had influenced federal policy on rural banking. The Small Business Administration created a specific program to support the establishment of community-owned financial institutions, directly citing the Millbrook example in their policy documentation. The success had personal impacts as well. Walter Pemberton's eldest son, Clayton, returned to Millbrook after graduating from the University of Georgia with a degree in agricultural economics. Instead of leaving for opportunities in Atlanta, as many young people did, Clayton saw a future in the community his father had helped revitalize. "Dad always told me that the land was in our blood," Clayton Pemberton said years later. "But what I learned was that community is in our blood too." The credit union didn't just save farms, it saved the idea that small towns can control their own destiny. The ripple effects extended beyond economics. The confidence gained from successfully establishing the credit union led to other community initiatives. In 1974, Millbrook residents organized to bring a regional medical clinic to town. In 1976, they successfully lobbied the state to improve rural internet infrastructure. Each success reinforced the lesson Ray Charles had helped them learn, that communities could create change when they worked together. Ray Charles continued to visit Millbrook regularly, often performing at the annual harvest festival that celebrated both the agricultural season and the community's economic independence. These weren't formal concerts but intimate gatherings where Ray would play piano while community members shared stories, danced, and celebrated their achievements. Mr. Charles never acted like he was the star, recalled Agnes Whitmore, the retired teacher who had been among the first to contribute to the emergency loan fund. He acted like we were all part of the same story, and his job was just to help us tell it. The Millbrook Community Credit Union weathered the economic challenges of the late 1970s and early 1980s better than many larger financial institutions. When national banks were failing due to bad loans and poor management, the credit union's conservative lending practices and deep community knowledge kept it stable. During the 1980 recession, it actually grew, as people transferred their accounts from larger banks they no longer trusted. The credit union's success also created opportunities for innovation in other areas. In 1981, it partnered with the Regional Electric Cooperative to offer loans for energy-efficient farm equipment and home improvements. This partnership became a model for rural electrification programs throughout the Southeast. Walter Pemberton served as president of the credit union until 1983, when he stepped down to focus on mentoring other rural communities facing similar challenges. By then, he had helped establish credit unions in 12 other towns, always emphasizing the same principles Ray Charles had taught him. Listen to the community, build on existing strengths, and never underestimate people's ability to solve their own problems. The educational impact of the Millbrook story extended into academia as well. Dr. Sarah Mitchell used the case study in her economics courses, and by 1985, the Harvard Business School had included the Millbrook Community Credit Union in their curriculum on community development. Students from around the country came to study how a small rural town had created a sustainable solution to economic crisis. But for all the attention and accolades, the people of Millbrook remained focused on practical concerns. The credit union continued to serve its core mission of supporting local agriculture and small business development. It financed the expansion of farms, supported new businesses, and provided affordable home loans to young families. Ray Charles's final official visit to Millbrook came in 1989, for the 20th anniversary of the emergency loan fund that had started everything. By then, the community credit union had assets of over $8 million and had financed hundreds of loans that kept the local economy strong. The town's population had actually grown during a period when many rural communities were shrinking. Standing once again on the courthouse steps where Walter Pemberton had cried out in desperation 2 decades earlier, Ray Charles reflected on what had been accomplished. 20 years ago, we thought the problem was that the bank closed, he said to the crowd of over 500 people who had gathered for the celebration. But closing that bank was the best thing that ever happened to this community, because it forced you to discover you didn't need them. You needed each other. The model continues to influence community development strategies across rural America, proving that the principles Ray Charles helped establish in Millbrook, community control, local knowledge, and mutual support remain relevant and effective tools for economic empowerment. Today, over 200 communities have used the Millbrook model to establish their own community-controlled financial institutions, creating a network of cooperative economic development that spans multiple states. The Millbrook story also influenced Ray Charles's approach to his music business. Inspired by the cooperative model he had helped establish, he restructured his own business operations to include profit-sharing arrangements with his band members and support staff. This approach was revolutionary in the music industry, where most artists maintained traditional employer-employee relationships with their musicians. If community ownership works for banks, it can work for bands too, Ray Charles explained in a 1979 interview with Ebony magazine. The people who help create the music should share in its success. This philosophy influenced other musicians and contributed to broader changes in how the music industry compensated performers and supporting artists. The educational programs pioneered by the Millbrook Community Credit Union became particularly influential. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood's financial literacy curriculum was adopted by rural schools throughout Georgia and eventually influenced state educational standards. By teaching young people about cooperative economics, budgeting, and community development, these programs helped ensure that future generations would have the skills needed to maintain economic independence. The success of the Millbrook model attracted attention from international development organizations as well. In 1984, representatives from 3 African nations visited Millbrook to study how the cooperative banking model might be adapted for rural communities in developing countries. The visit led to a partnership program where Millbrook residents shared their experiences with agricultural communities in Kenya and Ghana. Walter Pemberton's transformation from desperate farmer to community leader became a model for rural leadership development. The Georgia Extension Service invited him to speak at conferences throughout the Southeast, and his presentations focused on practical strategies for community organizing and cooperative development. His message was always the same: don't wait for someone else to save your community. The power is already there. You just have to organize it. The long-term sustainability of the Millbrook approach was demonstrated during the farm crisis of the 1980s. When falling commodity prices and high interest rates devastated rural communities across America. While many areas lost farms and businesses, Millbrook's diversified economy and community-controlled financial institution helped buffer the impact. The credit union was able to restructure loans, provide emergency assistance, and support farmers as they adapted to changing market conditions. During this difficult period, Ray Charles made several benefit concerts to support struggling rural communities, always emphasizing the lessons learned in Millbrook. One community proved it could be done, he would tell audiences. Now it's up to other communities to prove it can be done everywhere. These concerts raised over $300,000 for rural development programs and helped establish credit unions in dozens of additional communities. The technological innovations that emerged from the Millbrook model also had lasting impacts. The credit union's partnership with the electric cooperative led to early experiments with computer-based record-keeping and electronic fund transfers, making rural banking more efficient and accessible. These innovations were later adopted by credit unions throughout the region and contributed to the modernization of rural financial services. By the 1990s, the Millbrook Community Credit Union had evolved beyond its original agricultural focus to become a full-service financial institution serving a diverse membership. It offered business loans, mortgages, auto loans, and savings accounts to anyone in the region while maintaining its commitment to community development and cooperative principles. The institution's success had helped stabilize the entire county's economy. The personal relationships formed during the crisis of 1969 remained strong decades later. Walter Pemberton and Ray Charles maintained a correspondence until Ray's death in 2004, with Walter providing updates on community developments and Ray offering advice on business matters and community organizing strategies. Their friendship represented the lasting bonds that can form when people work together to solve common problems. The impact on subsequent generations was perhaps the most significant long-term outcome. Michael Pemberton, Walter's son, became a leader in sustainable agriculture, using the financial stability provided by the credit union to experiment with organic farming methods and renewable energy systems. His farm became a demonstration site for environmentally responsible agriculture, attracting visitors from around the world. The credit union's commitment to youth development led to scholarship programs that helped local students attend college while encouraging them to return to the community. By 2000, over 200 young people had received educational assistance from the credit union, and approximately 60% had returned to live and work in the area after graduation. This reverse of the typical rural brain drain helped ensure the community's continued vitality. The model's influence on academic research was substantial as well. The Millbrook case study was cited in over 150 scholarly articles on community development, cooperative economics, and rural banking. It became a standard example in textbooks on economic development and was used to train community development professionals at universities across the country. Ray Charles's final visit to Millbrook in 2003, just months before his death, demonstrated the enduring impact of the community development work that had begun 34 years earlier. The town had not only survived but thrived, with a population that had grown by 40% since 1969. New businesses had located in Millbrook specifically because of the community's reputation for cooperation and innovation. Standing once more on the courthouse steps, now marked with a historical plaque commemorating the founding of the credit union, Ray Charles addressed a crowd that included original participants in the 1969 Emergency Loan Fund, their children and grandchildren, and visitors from communities that had replicated the Millbrook model. 34 years ago, Walter Pemberton stood on these steps and cried out that they were taking his farm. Ray Charles said, his voice still strong despite his advancing years. Today, this community controls not just its own farms, but its own financial institution, its own economic destiny, and its own future. You didn't just save farms, you saved the idea that democracy can work at the community level. The story serves as a reminder that sustainable change comes not from outside intervention, but from helping communities recognize and mobilize their own resources and capabilities. Ray Charles understood that his role was not to solve problems for people, but to help them discover their own power to create solutions. In doing so, he demonstrated that the most important performance an artist can give isn't always on a stage. Sometimes it's in helping communities discover their own voice and their own strength.